thanks to you all for coming. As was just said, I'm going to be performing poems from Creatures of the Intertidal Zone, which is a collection of poetry which was published a couple of years ago now by Cinnamon Press, a small independent, mainly focusing on poetry press up in North Wales. And my particular collection was inspired by a journey that I took through Iceland, Greenland and Newfoundland in the footsteps of an intrepid 11th century female Viking called Gudrid Jökulbjarnadóttir, but I think I'll just call her Gudrid. It's slightly easier to call her Gudrid. And also to explore or to look at the impact of climate change and environmental issues on the Arctic and subarctic regions. I started off in the west part of Iceland, or in an area called the Snaefellsnes Peninsula, which is I suppose a rather it looks like quite a gnarled arthritic finger jutting out into the North Atlantic. And Gudrid's birthplace was on this particular peninsula at the base of a now extinct volcano, which is topped by a glacier. And it's quite obvious now that the glacier is melting at an alarming rate. I was very fortunate to be introduced to the ecology, history, geology of the region by a very hearty band of Icelandic National Park rangers, and they talked to me quite extensively about the fact that the ice is now melting at an alarming rate, much more quickly than it has done in previous decades. You can actually hear it creaking. It's no longer, the tourists are no longer encouraged to actually climb the glacier. It used to be one of those big tourist expeditions to climb to the top of the glacier. It's in fact, it's the glacier and volcano that was featured in Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth. I suppose that's what really prompted people to start climbing it and exploring it in the first place. But really now exploration is off limits. It's a bit too dangerous to do so. So I was very aware of the melting of the ice while I was there. And I was also introduced, while I was there, to the work of an environmental artist who specialises in sculpting enormous penguins from blocks of ice and then leaving them to melt outside environmental conferences and outside Parliament buildings. And so I thought it would be interesting if I could write a poem in the voice of one of these slowly melting penguins. It's called Defrosting. The man who brings forth life from ice has left, and there was just one breath between his last chip and the first drip, drip from my wingtip, one breath which bridged my birth and the birth of my death, one brief breath of perfection. Those in charge claim they wish to save me. They pose for photos right beside me, arms thrown round the shape which was, a moment ago, my shoulder. Click, click, shiny smiles. Meanwhile, their hands' heat hastens my decay. I dream of being carved from an Arctic of ice, from a berg so big, millennia would bridge my beginning and my end. With all my might, I visualize white so hard, I think I'm winning till drip, drip, my blubber's thinned to nearly nothing. I'm binge eating heat against my will. Down goes the blistering pill of the sun with one swallow. I won't last, you know, much past tomorrow. If you blink, blink, you'll miss my shift to liquid from solid. I resolve, though, to dissolve with dignity, to brave the tingles, pins and needles, pain, as I shift from ice to space, till all of me flippers to beak, fades to memory, till even this begins to drip, drip, drip. Having been in Iceland and familiarised myself both with the life of Gudrid, in whose footsteps I was following, and also speaking to quite a lot of experts, particularly at the University of Reykjavik, about climate change and environmental issues in that particular area. I was fortunate enough to be able to move on to Greenland, and I had a far happier journey than Gudrid had. When she travelled to Greenland, she was only an adolescent at the time, She'd already lost her mother when she was quite young, and she had a really tumultuous journey to Greenland. There was underwater volcano action, and most members of the crew perished. She fortunately survived, but I had a much more comfortable voyage to Greenland, and I suppose whenever I was actually on a boat at sea, it did make me realise how hardy Gudrid must have been, because she would have been there under the cramped half decks night after cramped night, her skin probably raw with sores from perpetually wet clothing, and I really had it easy in comparison in my windproof, waterproof Gore-Tex and my waterproof boots, and it really did encourage me to have even more respect for her, I think. Greenland is really quite interesting. It has quite interesting connections with the Norse and with the Vikings, in the sense that Gudrid and her people were part of that, the band of Norse and Vikings who were not into the raping and pillaging that we most commonly associate with Vikings. They were into peaceful exploration and settlement. And so there were two small Norse colonies on the west coast of Greenland, known as the Eastern Colony. Even though it was on the west coast, it was known as the Eastern Colony and the Western Colony. And I think if we're talking about a global warming climate change issues, the Norse were in Greenland during the medieval warm period from 800 to 1300 approximately, and this was one of the reasons why they were able to go there and farm very successfully, because the climate was warmer than it had been previously. When it started getting cold, the Norse actually failed to adapt to the climate change that was happening at the time. They didn't learn from the Inuit. They didn't move to a primarily fish-based diet, which would have been the wisest thing to do. They carried on farming and relied on dairy, on the cows that they brought with them from Iceland. And because of their failure to adapt, they actually died out in Greenland, and there are just a few remains of houses and farms there now. It's quite clear from having found Norse bones and so on, skeletons and so on in that area, that they were very malnourished, and they completely failed to adapt to the climate change, in this case the chilling, the colding that was taking place at the time. So I certainly felt that there were quite a few lessons that we need to learn in terms of adapting and learning before things are too late for us, really. As well as visiting Gudrid's birthplace, I was able to experience husky sledding in the far north of Greenland, and a poem which came from that experience is called Waiting at the Breathing Hole, and it's not really just about husky sledding. It also became a poem about attempting to overcome all kinds of obstacles in life, and I suppose very much in my mind at this time was the obstacle of trying to convince people that there is such a thing as climate change, because there are still quite a number of deniers that I was coming into contact with. So this is Waiting at the Breathing Hole. The white of this screen burns my eyes. Its unswerving glare might well make me snowblind. There was a time when words would fly across the screen like a dog team speeding, each at its peak and pulling equally, and all I'd have to do was leap aboard the sledge, guide it in the right direction, then relish the ride. But suddenly we hit uneven ice, bumped over ridges. I fell from the sledge, the dogs fled. The instructions I yelled had no meaning. So now, with tender eyes, I must hunt for a hole in the white and wait, patient at the rim, for the whiskered nose of inspiration, for a flippant urge to surge to the surface. And when it comes, I won't shoot it, harpoon it, skin it, rip its liver out and eat it raw, leave banners of blood on the snow. No, I'll feed it all the saffron, cod and shrimp it needs, teach it to move with the ease it knows beneath the ice. But first, I'll just take a few steps back and let it breathe.